How's it going, guys? Girls, hope you guys had a great week. So 2019 is at an end and we're about to move into 2020, which looks incredible. But before we do that, let's look back at 2019 and let's look at some of the highs and some of the lows. So this video today is actually going to focus on the 6 worst games or gaming moments of 2019. Of course, I'm sure there are many other things that happened last year that you would put on this list, but this is my own personal list. These are what I picked in my top 6. So without further ado, let's get started. Number 6, Ghost Recon Breakpoint. So this came out back in July and it sounded like a really cool concept when it actually came out. You know, this whole idea of you get dropped on an island and instead of being the one doing the hunting, you actually become the hunted. So it sounded really interesting, but sadly, unfortunately, this game absolutely did not live up to the hype. It released in such a broken state. It was kind of an embarrassment for Ubisoft, to be fair, and there were so many bugs and glitches in the game, and then to top it all off, the gameplay was really bland. Visually, it wasn't particularly impressive, and then the game didn't really have any real identity. You know, it was trying to basically be every single Ubisoft game wrapped into one package. So it had elements of Assassin's Creed with the dialogue choices, elements of The Division 2 with its whole looter shooter elements, and then elements, of course, of Ghost Recon or Wildlands. But it didn't really take what was best in those games and improve upon them. It just seemed like it didn't really know what it was, and that it was trying to be a little bit of everything without really pleasing anyone. Then, to add insult to injury, Ubisoft introduced some pretty shocking monetization systems. Initially, of course, it started out as purely cosmetic, but then gradually over time, Ubisoft started to introduce some pretty dodgy kind of pay to win, pay for convenience kind of systems. You know, you could pretty much buy weapons, armor, upgrades, even XP boosters, and even damn right skill points with real world money. And Ubisoft, when they were called out on this BS, tried to make it out like the introduction of these pay to win elements and these pay for convenience elements and these pretty shocking money grabbing systems were accidental, and that they were actually going to be added in at a later point further along the line when the game had been out for quite a couple of months, and they tried to play it off that they were trying to put those in to help maybe newcomers to the game that needed a little bit of support to catch up with currently existing customers in the community. I mean, come on, it was a pretty flimsy excuse on the part of Ubisoft. Ghost Recon Breakpoint just screamed of lazy game development. It screamed of money grabbing, shady practices on the part of Ubisoft, and yeah, definitely Ghost Recon Breakpoint was a perfect example of that. It was a pretty shocking game, and I definitely recommend that you do not pick this game up. Even if it's in the sale, it is not worth picking up. Number 5, Google Stadia. So this came out on the 19th of November, and it's pretty safe to say that the release of Google Stadia was pretty rocky and is still rocky. There were a ton of issues with it. When Google Stadia first came out and they first announcing it, it had some pretty cool features, you know, some pretty awesome things that you could do. But then when Google Stadia actually released in November, a ton of those features were missing at launch. You then had to spend $130 to actually access Stadia by purchasing the Founders Edition. The whole idea with Google Stadia is that you could play on any screen, but this actually, as it turned out, had limited functionality, and you needed to purchase extra hardware in order to be able to play Google Stadia as it was meant to be played. So if you had a TV, really you needed to get Google Chromecast Ultra to be able to take advantage of the 4K 60 frames per second ability of Google Stadia. If you were on PC, it pretty much capped out at 1080p at 60 frames per second, and you had to use Chrome. And then on a phone, you actually needed to have a Pixel device to be able to use Google Stadia at all. The roster of games that came out on release were pretty shocking, but then it had really massive performance issues. The game looked and performed worse on Stadia. There were huge issues with input and latency lag, and there was a massive reliance on internet connection and stability. And if you didn't have a very good internet connection, you really couldn't take advantage of Google Stadia. And there were massive issues, some games even being completely unplayable just because of the lag and the latency issues that people experience. A lot of the games that did come out as well, you could really at most play them at 1080p. Google Stadia was not really meeting its promise of 4K resolution, 60 frames per second. It definitely seemed that a lot of games just were not capable of it. Then on top of that, you had a monthly fee to actually access the library of games available to you, which is still pretty lackluster. But then to add more insult to injury, new game releases that came out in December, like Borderlands 3 for example, actually released outdated with missing content and updates and patches that had been introduced to the game on their console equivalents. So Google Stadia just seemed like it was a rushed product, and it did not perform well at launch, and it's massively hurt the sales for Google Stadia. It really has massively underperformed. It doesn't look good for Google Stadia. This looks like one of Google's projects that kind of gets swept under the rug, particularly when we look at the next gen consoles coming out next year. We've got the PS5, and then we've also got the Xbox Series X, both of which promise to be incredibly powerful pieces of kit, and I just don't think Google Stadia can compete with that. So yeah, Google Stadia definitely was one of the worst moments of 2019 without a doubt. Number 4, EA's surprise mechanics. So this news hit on the 19th of June. This was just an hilarious moment. It was hilarious and painful. So basically in June, a UK Parliament House of Commons committee called the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee were investigating loot boxes and predatory practices in video games. They asked representatives from a couple of the big major games companies, including Epic Games and EA, to attend the committee to basically answer questions with relation to loot boxes and gambling in video games. So EA's VP of Legal and Government Affairs, Kerry Hopkins, when asked about predatory practices of loot boxes and whether or not she had any ethical qualms when it came to loot boxes, responded with the incredibly memed surprise mechanics. So she basically said EA doesn't really like to call them loot boxes, they prefer to call them surprise mechanics, and actually then said that they were quite ethical and quite fun, and actually had the audacity to compare loot boxes to Kinder eggs. Most everybody who responded and listened to this just scoffed. This statement was so ridiculous. They're just not surprise mechanics. Nobody was buying the fact that they were surprise mechanics. But what I will say, one of the highlights and one of the best moments of 2019 was just to see the fact that, more government bodies were taking interest in loot boxes, that they're being investigated, and that finally game publishers are being held accountable and are being questioned on their incredibly dodgy and predatory practices when it comes to microtransactions and loot boxes, to the extent that a lot of big video game publishers now have started to remove loot boxes from their games and have started to look at other elements of microtransactions. But it definitely shows that a lot of big publishers are really seeing the risk involved, not only in terms of their reputation, but also a financial and legal risk as well if they choose to implement loot boxes into their games. So it's good to see that a lot of these publishers are being held accountable and being held under a magnifying glass, and I was happy to see that. And I was happy to see that people sort of scoffed at this surprise mechanics, but it made for some pretty amusing head-scratching news back in June 2019. Number 3, Wolfenstein Youngblood. So this is another occasion this year where Bethesda really dropped the ball. Wolfenstein Youngblood was one of the worst games that came out in 2019. It was released on the 26th of July, of course developed by Machine Games and Arcane Studios. Now, I have always been a massive fan of the Wolfenstein franchise. I actually really enjoyed Wolfenstein, particularly New Colossus. I thought that was a great game great gameplay, great experience, and I was super excited for Wolfenstein Youngblood when that was announced. It sounded really cool. It was going to have 2-player local and online co-op throughout the entirety of the main campaign. It was going to continue on the story, and it was picking up 20 years after the events of New Colossus. It was featuring Jesse and Sophia, who were the twins of BJ Blazkowicz and Anya, two of the main characters in the first and second game. And then it was set in Nazi-occupied France, and you're fighting on the side of the French Revolution. It sounded really cool. It sounded like all the really cool elements were there, but then the game released and it was awful. I mean, it was so bad that I know a lot of people that just put this game down and just didn't finish it, or were just cringing the entire time through. Yeah, the gunplay was still good, but the level design was shocking. It was really boring, sort of lazy, recycled level design. The gameplay mechanics and gameplay loops weren't particularly interesting, nor were the mission structures. And then to top that all off, the writing was awful. It was so cringeworthy. It was like the writing of the game was done by like 5-year-olds or, you know, pre-pubescent teens. It was, I basically liken it to Beavis and Butthead. It is the Beavis and Butthead approach to the Wolfenstein series. The two main characters of Jesse and Sophia were just incredibly unlikable and just incredibly annoying and irritating. There were so many moments in the story where I was just cringing, and it was just really uncomfortable to play and to experience. So Wolfenstein Youngblood was probably one of the biggest disappointments of 2019. Hopefully Doom Eternal will get it right next year. It looks good. That game looks good, and I'm just hoping that Bethesda don't screw it up like they've screwed a lot of things up this year. Which brings us quite nicely to number 2, which is Fallout 76, and more specifically Fallout First. So Bethesda had a pretty terrible year this year. I mean, shockingly bad. In April, they announced that they were going to break their cosmetics only promise when it came to their microtransactions, and that they would actually start to introduce other forms of microtransactions, some of which would eventually become pay to win and pay for convenience. So they started introducing scrap kits, later on refrigerators, and then collectron bots. What was really shocking for me was that many of these introductions were based on suggestions that had actually been made by the community on social media and on different forums, and these suggestions were taken on board by Bethesda and then sold back to them as purchasing items, which is just disgusting that Bethesda would do that to their fans, and particularly to people that have stuck by Fallout 76. And it just seems that Bethesda just want to screw them over every which way that they can, particularly when they started introducing some patches to fix some bugs, which actually ended up introducing more game-breaking bugs and other game-breaking bugs. And then to add more insult to injury, in late October, Bethesda then announced the Fallout First subscription, which would charge players $100 a year and $12.99 a month subscription, which would give them access to private servers, stash boxes, survival tents, 1,650 atoms a month, which equates to about $15, and of course unique cosmetics. That's insulting in itself. I mean, that is utterly disgusting, particularly when you look at other subscription services like the Xbox Games Pass, for example, which charges about $10 a month, and they get access to a roster of games and a massive library with over 100 games. And then you have, you know, Bethesda turning around and thinking that it's okay for them to offer such a substandard subscription service, but then to charge charge people for stuff that really should be free. This shit on the subscription should be free. They should not be charging players for this. They should be giving this content to players for free as a thank you for them to continuing to stick with the game and to continuing to support it. So it's utterly shocking. But then what was even more shocking was that Fallout First then launched. Some people bafflingly chose to purchase this subscription, which is so frustrating because it was just such a disgusting thing for Bethesda to do. And sometimes speaking with your wallet does have an impact. It had an impact on EA with Battlefront 2, and it's frustrating that some people chose to buy this subscription service, but hey, that's everyone's choice if they choose to put down their money and do that. But then this subscription service launched, but then it launched completely broken. So these scrap boxes ended up deleting items. The private servers were actually not as private as they had been made out. I think there was even some point where people were trying to buy the subscription and it just wouldn't let them buy it, which is karma if I've ever heard of it. So yeah, I don't understand Bethesda this year. I don't get it. I don't understand the people behind the key decision makers at Bethesda, what makes them think that this kind of shit is okay. I just really don't understand it. So Bethesda's had a pretty shocking year in 2019. They've got a lot to make up for, so they've got a lot to make up for going ahead into 2020. Hopefully they can redeem themselves a little bit with Doom Eternal, because the game does still look really, really good, and I'm hoping it's going to live up to the hype, and I'm really hoping that the Bethesda doesn't find some way to screw it up, because knowing Bethesda, never say never. And finally, number 1 is Anthem. So Anthem was definitely the biggest disappointment of 2019 for me. It was the worst gaming disappointment. It's not a terrible game, you know what I mean? Probably I would say Wolfenstein Youngblood and Ghost Recon are probably a lot worse than Anthem. But for me, it's number 1 on my list just because of how disappointing it was for me and how heartbreaking it was for me to see BioWare fall so terribly. And it's not just the performance of the game, but it's everything that we learned around it, everything that we learned about its development, about the way things are being run at BioWare at the moment, about the state of the developer as they currently stand. And it's everything surrounding the news that's really sort of hit very close to home this year and has been incredibly disappointing. So obviously Anthem came out at the beginning of the year, on the 22nd of February. It was their first original IP since Mass Effect and Dragon Age, so all eyes were on them, particularly after the massive disappointment that was Mass Effect Andromeda for many fans of BioWare. And unfortunately, Anthem definitely did not live up to the hype. It launched in an incredibly broken state. There were so many issues with bugs and glitches. There were huge issues with server issues and lag. The game was even causing systems to crash and then to brick. You then had really boring gameplay loops and mechanics, a shockingly poor loot system, weapon and armor sets that just didn't offer anything inspired or interesting, which was a massive travesty in a looter shooter. There was some blatant monetization in the form of the online store, which was selling armor mods and customization options, and it was very obvious that a lot of the armor sets and a lot of the customization had been lifted completely out of the game and was being sold back to gamers as microtransactions. It was very, very obviously a cheap money grabbing scheme on the part of, EA and BioWare. And it just was really, really disappointing. Even the story itself really didn't live up to the BioWare standard of story that we have had previously in the Mass Effect series and Dragon Age. It didn't feel like a BioWare game. It didn't feel like a game that had any particular clear vision or direction. And sadly, we found out why. In April, Jason Schreier released an article on Kotaku, which went behind the scenes and really sort of unveiled all the issues and all the problems that the game had had during its development cycle. It had a terrible management. It was just a rudderless ship. You know, no one knew what the game was supposed to be. Even at E3, when they released the first gameplay demo, none of it was real. It was all fake. Nobody knew what the game was and what it was supposed to look like, and it just seemed like no one was making the calls and no one was making the decisions. This game was worked on for 6 years, so to say that this was the final product and that they actually ended up building the game in the last year and a half of its development is pretty shocking, to say the least. Then on top of that, it sounds like the working situation at BioWare is not brilliant at the moment. There are a lot of staff that are off sick with depression, anxiety and stress and pressures, and it just seems like the whole management ethos really isn't there, and it's really heartbreaking to hear that, because BioWare's always been a developer that I have always looked up to. They were one of my favorite video game developers. Mass Effect is one of the biggest franchises that influenced me as a gamer. It's one of the reasons I became a YouTuber. So I've always been a passionate supporter of BioWare. So to see the developer that I love so dearly fall to such standards is quite heartbreaking for me. And then as the year has progressed, fortunately things have not got much better. You know, when the game came out in February, you know, a lot of people thought, well, maybe they'll introduce patches, maybe they'll introduce more content. This is a games as a service. You know, this is BioWare's first online looter shooter. Maybe they will introduce things to get it right, to improve on these things, and they just didn't. In April, the roadmap that they had planned out for future content releases was delayed, and then ultimately it was scrapped altogether. The Cataclysm did eventually release, but it was just a massive disappointment, and it just didn't live up to the expectations and to the hype that we were promised. And then as the year progressed, we started to hear about key staff leaving the project and key staff leaving BioWare altogether and moving on to do other projects and to work with other development studios. So it just seemed like, you know, the really seasoned developers that we've known, the bones and the structure of the old BioWare that we know, that's not really there anymore, and the BioWare that we're left with really isn't the same BioWare that we know from Mass Effect and Dragon Age, and that makes me a little bit sad. We did get a slight ray of light in November when Jason Schreier did announce through an article that actually BioWare were planning to do a complete overhaul of the game, and that they were working on it behind the scenes and were looking at Anthem Next or Anthem 2.0. Whether this is released in future updates to the game or future DLC downloadable content, who knows? Maybe it'll be a brand new title and it'll be like the Destiny 2 of Anthem, who knows? But at least it's nice to hear that BioWare haven't completely given up on it, and that EA haven't completely given up on it. This hasn't been a post Mass Effect Andromeda where the studio was completely shut down after the disappointment of that. But for me, yeah, definitely Anthem was my worst moment of 2019. It was frustrating, it was heartbreaking. There were so many emotions when playing that game. So there you have it, guys. Those are the top 6 worst games and gaming moments of 2019. Hopefully we're not going to have as many next year. Hopefully 2020 will not be full of, you know, awful games and cringe-worthy moments, but I'm sure it will be, because every year there always seems to be some. But that's just my top 6 out of 2019. So I am interested to hear what your worst moments of 2019 were and what your worst games of 2019 were as well in the comment section below. Please comment, please share your thoughts. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button to show your support. Comment, subscribe, follow the channel, become a member, hit that join button as well. So any support you can show is massively appreciated. But let's move on. The next video I'm going to be doing is obviously more positive in focus, and in my next video I will be finally laying down which are my top 10 best games that came out in 2019. That will be up hopefully within a couple of days, so please look forward to that. Anyway, I hope you guys having a great week. Take care, and as always, happy gaming. Bye guys.